Hello, everyone. Thank you for joining us today for a conversation about truth and reconciliation in the classroom. My name is Brooke Campbell, and I'm the Acting Director of Programs at Canada's National History Society. And I did want to take a moment to acknowledge that I'm streaming this from Canmore, Alberta, which is part of Treaty 7 territory, the ancestral lands of the Stoney Nakoda, Blackfoot Confederacy, and Tsuut'ina Nations. Now, historically, the Bow Valley has been a traditional gathering place for many Indigenous peoples, and the landscapes that surround me, the beautiful mountains, river, all of that holds really special meaning. And that I'm so grateful to not only be able to work and live here, but to really be able to learn more about and to honor these connections to the land and to these sacred places. In the past 3 months, thousands of unmarked graves have been discovered at former residential school sites. The discoveries of these sites adds to our growing understanding of the truth of the residential school system. And as conversations are occurring across the country about truth and reconciliation and the 94 calls to action, students are preparing to, or have already, returned to school. They no doubt have questions. Today, we're going to hear from some educators. They're going to share their own experiences and unique perspectives. You're going to hear some recommendations and learn about some of the different ways that you might be able to talk about the history and legacy of residential schools with your students. After the conversation, our panelists will be taking audience questions. So please submit your questions to the Q&A box that you should be able to find in the bottom bar of your Zoom panel. And feel free to join in the conversation as well using the chat box. Now, I don't want to take any more of your time. And I want you to meet all of our fantastic panelists. So I am going to pass it over to them to introduce themselves and to begin this conversation.
Hello, Tanse. Hello, bonjour. My name is Gavin Bergeron. I'm from Winnipeg, Manitoba, and a proud member of Nisitawayasik Cree Nation. Back in 2015, I had the honor of attending and participating in the Truth and Reconciliation Commission in Ottawa, representing the youth in my the school board at that time. And so I want to say thank you for inviting me here today. A little bit about myself. During my time in my undergrad, I had the privilege of representing Indigenous students at St. Paul University, whether to be in the Indigenous Center on campus, as well as for the Student Association. Another role I had was I took care of the in-house elders while they're on campus. And for me, that was such a special moment and a role for me. I also at the time I worked in Manitoba for Indigenous Service Canada, working closely with Indigenous leadership that included chiefs, elders, and respected members of the community. This past year, however, I worked as an EA with the Winnipeg School Division, which has brought me here. So thank you.
My name is Sylvia Smith. I'm coming to you from unceded and unsurrendered Algonquin territory from a city that's now known as Ottawa. And I am a second generation settler. I was born on Treaty 6 territory. I grew up there on a farm just outside Saskatoon. But for the last 30 years or so, I have made my home here on Algonquin territory, and I try my best to be a responsible citizen of this territory. The Algonquin people have had it a more difficult time than a lot of other nations because Ottawa is the Canadian capital center and there are so many different nations that come together here. So that's one of the things that I am committed to, is to highlight the resurgences and also the challenges of Algonquin peoples. Just a little bit, I'm a retired teacher now. But I did teach for over 25 years at an alternative high school. And that is where, along with my students, we learned about Indian residential schools. That was back in 2006. And it was quite a journey from then until the time I retired, because the Truth and Reconciliation Commission had been doing all its work. And that is when Project of Heart became an event that was held at the national events of the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, because it centered on learning about the children, the schools, and all the children that died as a result of the depredations they experienced at the schools. So with that, I'm going to just let you know that I'm very humbled and honored to be with this panel here today and to be able to answer some questions from those who are participating. Thanks very much.
Hi there, I'm Maxine Hildebrandt. I've been a teacher for 9 years at a small rural school about an hour west of Edmonton, Alberta. And I've been primarily teaching in a school that serves a high population of First Nation students. I myself am First Nation. I'm a member of the Pelican Lake First Nation in Saskatchewan. That's located approximately 2 hours north of Saskatoon. I'm Cree on my mother's side and Métis on my father's side. I'm very interested in teaching our upcoming youth about our history and of our people and getting them familiar with the stories that have been lost or not spoken about. It seems like our history growing up has been very one-sided. We didn't learn about a lot of the stories of coming from First Nation people in our history books. And I myself grew up in going through the educational system, not really knowing too much about residential schools and not really learning about them, even though I've had close family members that have been raised in residential schools and as well boarding schools. So yeah, that's where I'm coming from. I'm a wife, a mother, a grandmother of 4 beautiful little granddaughters, and I'm interested in raising them to know more about their history and their culture. Oh, and so with that, I think we'll just go straight into our questions that we're talking about. We've prepared some questions for today that we'd like to discuss. And I will introduce the first one. This question is out to just for towards educators. It deals with how do you introduce the history of residential schools to students who have never heard about it before. And I have to say that even though I teach in a school where 95% of our students are First Nation students, a lot of them actually don't know a lot about residential schools, and we've partnered with other schools where we've learned, talked with other students who also didn't have, an understanding of residential schools and what they represent, and I found that for myself, not that I don't personally believe that there's a one size fits all solution and of a way to teach about residential schools. I'm just telling you how I do it. So when I'm introducing this topic to students, first of all, you need to know your students, and you need to know, what their background is, what level of learning they're at, how it's developmentally appropriate to teach them. And so I generally would start off with reading a story, a piece of literature, perhaps that was written by a residential school survivor. And I might, start off with a true account of what it was like to live in a residential school and to go there for studying and being raised in there. From there, we would have questions and class discussion about residential schools, and basically why they were even created. Why do we need them? And to go into that kind of a discussion, you need to understand a little bit about early Canadian history, and and just be able to talk about how, when our country was first established, how early policies of assimilation seemed to be the way to help Indigenous people basically interact and become with mainstream Canadian society, just to kind of fit in. And so, you know, you kind of bring in, you know, like how our country was formed, and you kind of go into the, you know, laying out the history of it, and the reasons why the government even brought in residential schools, what was the purpose behind it. And the purpose of it was to help, you know, it was to separate Indigenous people from their culture and to, you know, fit in with mainstream society. So we usually start there, and then we look at the stories that emerge from there, like the questions, looking at the you know, the survivors and what it means to have their stories told and accepted, and, you know, basically we move on from there. So I guess I would start off by bringing in a story, having class discussions, perhaps even talking to elders, bringing and having them come in and share their stories and answer questions that students have. And then it just kind of, the learning takes off from there. So I'll pass that on to Sylvia next and see what you have to say about that.
Oh, thank you so much. And thanks for letting us know how you would even bring up something like that when there are so many people who are still so ignorant of any other type of history than white stream history. How to adapt your teaching for younger learners and ensuring it's age appropriate is something that is incredibly important, because we grew up knowing that we don't want to traumatize children. But, you know, we don't want to traumatize anyone. We don't want to traumatize older students. We don't want to traumatize adults. And I think the only way to teach things and teach things in an age appropriate way, and I'm going to reiterate how important Maxine's point is, you have to know your students. You have to know them. And that is the first thing that I would do with all of your students. Find out a little bit about their background, find out about the things they like, the things they don't like, get to know who their parents are. You actually have to start seeing yourself as a learner, an active learner with your young people. In other words, you're collaborating together in this learning journey that that ignites emotional reactions. So in order to do that, you have to build trust. That is, I think, the main thing, building trust with the young people. And I'm just going to tell you how I orchestrated the classroom and arranged it for my students, who ranged anywhere from between 14 years to 18 years. So the first thing I did was I learned a little bit about them individually, their families. When I got to the part in our history books where we were to teach about the early settlement of Canada, it was at a time, this was around 2007, 2006, when we first got into teaching about when I first got into teaching about Indian residential schools, because of a young student who was doing some extra research and came upon the report of Peter Bryce, who was the Indian residential school doctor at the time. It was because of her response, her emotional response to reading that report that contained in it the deaths of children, that I became I became concerned about the responses of other students. And that is when we actually really had to come together, even as a staff, and talk about how do you teach these difficult knowledges. So what happened over a period of time is that I found that what worked for me was letting the other, when we came to this topic, I would let the other teachers on staff know that that's what we were going to be doing in our class. I let the parents know of the students that we were going to be learning about some disturbing facts of Canadian history that the students hadn't learned before. So I let the parents or the grandparents, the caregivers, anyone who was important in that child's life know that that's what we were doing. And because we had on staff a social worker and a guidance counselor, I also let them know that that's what we were doing. So I tried as best I could to create an environment where the community, the school community was notified. I also really tried to find out in advance what the students' backgrounds were when it came to experiences that they'd had in their lives. The school I taught at was very mixed. It was a huge diversity. So these children, some of them had gone through war experiences, coming to Canada, some had been refugees. So it became really, really important for us to approach the topic with sensitivity and not back down when the learning got a little bit tougher. Taking advantage of the excellent resources that, now we had no resources at the time. 10, 15 years ago when I started doing this work, there were very little. There were only resources that came from the Aboriginal Healing Foundation. And I used those and incorporated that into my history teaching. But for teachers now, especially in elementary school and in the primary grades, there is a lot more, there's a lot more out there. And I would urge you to go to the Project of Heart website because there are resources listed there. I also have a lot that I could sort of physically show you here. But that is, that's the first place I would go. See what you can read to the children or read with the children. And even invite family members if there's anyone who could. Oh, I keep forgetting we're all Zoom now, aren't we? We're online. And I'm not teaching anymore, so I don't have to deal with that. But yes, resources are, there are a lot more resources out there. And the other thing that I would urge teachers of young people to do is acknowledge that there are going to be emotional responses from that and letting the children speak about their fears, allowing them to have that voice, because if they're not allowed to speak or to somehow demonstrate what they're feeling, then it's not going to be the teaching experience and the learning experience that you want. For my students, I had them doing art, and this all came together in the project, an Indian residential school project called Project of Heart, which commemorates the children who died. But art was a really big focus for us once they learned about some of the truths of Canadian history, truths that we had never learned and that they had never learned before. So art was a way. And then the other way that we dealt with the emotional content was to take what they had learned or what they were learning and have that outlet, besides a creative, that one of the creative outlets being art or music or whatever, also be a social justice piece. So to that end, my students got very active in supporting the First Nations Child and Family Caring Society. And this was like almost, you know, this was many years ago. They're still fighting the same fights they were back when my students supported them. And that's to have equitable access to health services, to educational services, to social services, all the services my children and my grandchild take for granted, and anyone who isn't a First Nations child. And that I found from my experience as a teacher was the most empowering thing that our students could do. That was get themselves involved. And now, and I want you to know that there are many really good children's resources coming out of the Caring Society, and all you have to do is go to their website. They're free, they're online, so you really can't lose. The other thing I would mention in terms of empowering the students to do something that that makes them feel, helps them own that knowledge, is to be able to talk to their families about it. And I found that with many of my students around this, the supper table on the weekends, they used their learning to talk to family members and those really difficult things, topics like racism, sexism, all the things, the isms that tend to marginalize people, the students found ways with their families. And sometimes I also got calls back from families about what their children were learning. But again, that uncomfortable learning opened the door for us to dispel some of the myths and the stereotypes that we learned, that non-Indigenous people, non-Aboriginal people learn from the knees of our parents and our grandparents and our communities. Okay, so I think I've used up my time allotment. I'm very prepared to share many of the any resources I can with you. But to that end, I'm going to hand it over to Gavin. Gavin, are you there? And you can speak to your question.
Thank you. Thank you. I appreciate that. Just to point out just to add on to what you're saying, I totally agree with the resources and whatnot. I think it's easy to forget that students' curiosity is such a driving factor into learning. And I know with the education field being here, you guys could definitely agree. With that being said, lots of students want to ask why. I mean, I was one of those students, and I imagine a lot of people are here as well, which is important. Answering those why questions is so important to engage that curiosity, to engage that learning, and whether that be with more chippy or upbeat topic, or something like residential schools, which have affected my family, my grandmother, my grandfather, and how can we bring that to be age appropriate, and focusing on those why questions could be the answer to that. How I relate it is, what are the values and beliefs that you see in schools revolving around everyday learning? We think about each school has kind of their focal points. You have your kindness, your sharing, your inclusivity, and maybe to introduce residential schools, teachers and staff can talk about what their school believes in, what their school environment is the best environment to learn in, and relate that to how residential schools did not do a lot of those things. They weren't inclusive. A lot of them had physical, mental, and sexual abuse, and how schools now these days they focus on a lot of the things that residential schools didn't, and that could be a really great segue into learning more and expanding on other ideas as students get older. I think that can be really important. And we talk about feeling unsafe when students are here learning. They want to be safe, and how do we convey that being in a safe space or a brave space, and talking about some of these hardships that survivors have felt? Getting that firsthand knowledge from survivors and elders within the community can be so important, and there's never going to be any shame or pushback if you want to seek out that firsthand knowledge, or at least there shouldn't be. So yeah, that I would say to that answer. I'll let Natasha introduce herself. Natasha, thank you. Oh, we would like for you to introduce yourself. We kind of did our introductions first, so now you had joined a bit late, so I would like you to introduce yourself to everyone.
Oh, okay, thank you. I want to say that first that I am a Francophone, so it's a little bit hard for me sometimes to speak in English, so be kind with me. And I apologize if I do some miss.
Natasha,
Yes.
Feel free to speak in French. We're being live translated. So please speak in French.
Merci beaucoup, Brooke. C'est vraiment gentil.
Thank you very much. It's very kind. So I'm very happy to join you. And So I am a development officer for the Indigenous Center, and this is at the heart of this is something that will give us resources for teachers for the integration of within the classroom. So this is why I wanted to join the panel to hear what is the reaction of those who have more experience on this subject, and also to see what are the resources that can be shared. I am here also to share. I would be happy to share the resources that we have. What I would like to see a retraction about the when we're trying to do integration, and we want to do it with a voice, with people. We want to invite people from the First Nations and to talk to us. I feel that sometimes it's always not obvious to determine how can we acknowledge, recognize the resources, and how can we do it to find in the community the elders who are acknowledged, right, recognized, or about their background, and I would like to see how people do this normally, to do the integration within the classroom, and when they bring people from the First Nations and in the classroom, and how they do it, the resource contact persons. I'm sorry, the sound is not great. Sorry about that.
Hi, sorry about that. Yeah, when I'm talking about unmarked, when I'm talking about unmarked graves and missing children with my students, when we first heard about these graves being found or being discovered, my students came in and they were grade 5 and 6 students, and also grade 3 and 4. And when they came in, they were asking, they were saying, what does this mean? Like, how are graves associated with schools, and why are there graves that's found at old residential schools? And so I think for me, it started by the kids having questions. So they brought their questions in, and I just basically was talking to them and saying, well, these students, these kids, when they were at school, there were a number of reasons why students may have passed away at school, and I guess it just started. It started in our class discussions, and I would see what kinds of questions they would have, and I'd kind of give an answer that I could speak to, that I knew about. And we also looked at some elders from the community that could share some of their stories. And I think that for example, if they're like in depending on where the residential school was, there, if the families lived in remote communities, and there were, back in the time period of the early residential schools especially, there was no way to communicate quickly to parents and let them know that something was, that if their child was sick or contracted some kind of sickness or whatever, like there was different reasons for why children passed away at these schools. And I think you just have to be open and honest and sharing with children that there's a number of reasons why this could have happened. And yeah, it's I guess it just validates a lot of the survivor stories that were coming out during the Truth and Reconciliation Commission. It was, you know, it was sad that a lot of the survivors were talking about their stories, and it may, you know, some people may have taken them seriously, some people may not have taken them seriously. But once these unmarked graves have come to light, you know, now people realize that they, you know, this opens up a lot of discussion as to why that happened, and why didn't it go on, you know, not, you know, like why were these deaths never acknowledged, and, you know, and they were unmarked. And, you know, there's I just found in my situation that in my school, kids would come to school with questions, and sometimes they had stories that they shared that you know, that they knew about in their families. And, you know, it's, before healing can occur, you just gotta, you know, you've got to talk about it and acknowledge.
Yeah.
So,
Thank you.
I don't know if somebody wants to add on to that.
Yeah, I'll actually, yeah, I definitely think what you're saying, Maxine, is so true, involving the community. I think in Indigenous tradition and culture, as you may know, involving the community is such an important piece to Wetaskiwin or community building, or Wetaskiwin meaning community, sorry. And with that, I think, you know, because death is such a, or can be a deep and personal topic, not all students are going to be comfortable talking or have been talked about it. I think of my experience. You know, I work in a school of kindergarten to grade 6. Those are very drastic ages where the comprehension of death and to unmarked graves is very different. And so, like, I totally agree with you. Involving the community, involving guardians, whether that be in the classroom, on a webinar, or at home. Educators are there to guide you in that, but not necessarily have all the answers. And I think that's something that Sylvia had touched on before. You know, we don't know everything, and that's okay. But being able to be there for your students and talking about this is what is most important, and creating those student educator relationships. One thing I would add, though, at the same time, is, you know, the way I was taught about residential schools, first from my family, but also from school, was we had a lot of reflection pieces talking about how we felt when we heard about these stories. And I think as educators, it's really important to have that connection with our students, that we can talk about emotion and acknowledge that in that way. So thank you, Maxine, for what you shared.
I really appreciate hearing this come out in the discussion. One of the things that I noticed when I was teaching was that while we had to talk about that almost the unimaginable, right? Children dying in places where they're supposed to be learning. The students, their taking in of this information made it very, very evident that before we got into doing the work to express ourselves, either through art or whatever, is we did a piece on the contributions. We would learn about an Indian residential school where the children had died, and learn something about the contributions of those people, of those original peoples on whose land that school stood. And it was really necessary to bring out the strengths to find out about these contributions Indigenous people made, either to their own nations or to Canada, so that the students had realized, or wouldn't be seeing Indigenous peoples through the victim lens, even though they were truly victims. So it's being able to get that balance correct. And I know most of our teachers are non-Indigenous teachers. I mean, that's just sort of the way it is. So those kinds of things are going to have to be learned. The learning curve is going to be really high and has been high for non-Indigenous people, especially white people. So I guess I'm speaking to the white educators out there. It's going to be super important for you to recognize your positioning in this as being privileged, very privileged, and as being part of the problem. So the more comfortable that we can get as white people, being inextricably wound up in this, our ancestors, sometimes not even so distantly related to us, involved in the schools, but not even if we weren't, recognizing that and trying to be as comfortable as you can with it, and always acknowledging that you're learning and you will be learning. That learning curve is high. Okay, over to someone else.
Thank you, Sylvia. Actually, I think this is a great opportunity to open to the Q&A. So I'll look at the Q&A right now and get the panelists to answer some of the questions, including myself. So Bozo, and this is from Stephanie Paquette. What would you recommend to, what grade would you recommend to start talking about residential schools, Miigwech? I think that's a great question. Personally, and I can open up to the floor to the class after, I think any age really, whether we kindergarten or to grade 12, I think it's any time is a good time as long as you're going to be age appropriate. And I think we had talked about that before, whether that be how you introduce through values and beliefs, all the way to what atrocities took place and how we can heal from that. I talk about, for myself, I like to think about listening, the ability to have oral and oral, so the ability to speak about it, but also the ability to listen. One of the best phrases I've heard is you want to listen to understand rather than listening to respond. So being able to hear these testimonies or hear these stories, whether that be for grade or kindergartners to grade 12, having those resources and talk and being able to listen to these stories, whether that's to respond or not, I think is super important. So I think honestly, it can be any grade as long as you're making that age appropriate.
I would have to agree with you, Gavin, on that. I do think that it, looking at introducing it at a certain grade, I don't know if I necessarily aspire to a certain grade. I know that, you know, little children can understand things as well, in as much as they're able to age appropriately. You know, I look at my granddaughters, and I have, one of them is 9 and the other one is 6. And sometimes they have questions like that are big type of questions. And, you know, I can respond, I take my cues of how I would respond to them. And in the classroom, I've had a lot of grade 3 and 4 kids, like 7 and 8-year-olds, asking me questions about residential schools. You know, they've heard stories in their family, and you know, maybe they've had relatives that have been in this residential schools or boarding schools, and they want to know more about it. For me, growing up, like I've known that, like hearing my mom talking about her experiences in schools, in a boarding school growing up. She would tell me would tell me stories, but she would just call it school. She never called it boarding school or you know, other relatives residential schools. Like, they never mentioned that. They just called it school, but would talk about their experiences. You know, I think when a person is interested and starts wanting to know more, and students wanting to know about it, you know, you just develop how your responses, what you're sharing with them at their level, and you just kind of go from there. I know some of my older students, when we're talking about development of our nation, and you know, talking about broader, wider topics, you know, a little bit about, we had a chance to talk about the history topics, like how our nation was formed, you know, the development of the numbered treaties and what that meant, and you know, living together with you know, Indigenous and non-Indigenous peoples coming together and learning together. I've been involved in cultural exchanges with my students, where we would partner with other schools, and we've had other neighboring schools that have wanted to know a little bit more of Indigenous perspectives, and they're looking for ways to bring Indigenous perspectives into their classroom in an authentic way. So, what better of a way than to actually talk to First Nation people and get to know them. And so we got to know some of our neighbors from other schools in our nearby vicinity, and we shared our stories with another. My Indigenous children were sharing their backgrounds and their, who they were, and with other students. And it's interesting because once you bring people together, you find commonalities and you find ways to appreciate your differences and your cultural differences. And so, we share this land, right? So we want our kids to be, learning from one another as well. So in my school, it's, if we want to learn about certain things, we'll bring in people that, will have answers, and, we will bring in elders, but elders not just for the sake of just bringing in an elder, but an elder to learn from, right? So, if you're going to bring an elder into your classroom, you've got to be willing to, to listen to them and listen to their stories and in an authentic way.
I really like Natasha and Maxine, the bringing in of, for me and for my experiences with my students, it was absolutely necessary to bring elders into the classroom, for many reasons. They were an influence for reflectivity, because the Indigenous guests that we had that came into the classroom used their words sparingly, but they also chose carefully. The students listened much more than they would have, I think, than if I were to be speaking. The other thing, when you're teaching about Indian residential schools, is that if you don't have someone from the community there, now it wouldn't always necessarily be a residential school survivor. It could be a knowledge keeper. It could be an intergenerational survivor. But there's someone there that can speak to the lived experience. And to me, the ethics behind the teaching and learning was greater. There was a much more, there was sharing that happened. And during that sharing, you could hear a pin drop. The students were engaged not just with their heads, but they were engaged with their hearts. And those experiences were experiences that were not, I use the term flushable. They were not flushable. They were transformative experiences for those students. And to my mind, that's what education should be. It doesn't matter what you're learning about. There should be an integration of the head and the heart, so that the students aren't wasting their time and that teachers aren't wasting theirs either.
Okay, so for the next question, we've had multiple questions talking about cultural appropriation, which I think is super important, whether it be in the classroom or in Canadian society. This question is, being accused of cultural appropriation is a real concern these days, which I agree. Can I, as a white teacher, teach my students about Indigenous handcrafts? For example, if we learn about dream catchers, who made them, how they are used and why, can we make them? Or is that disrespectful somehow? Would someone like to answer that? Do you have your mic on? Okay, you go ahead.
I would like to say first that it would be interesting to have the opinion of a First Nation or an Indigenous person. So I will just, on my side, what I can say is that there's some things that we kind of appropriate. It's not, and the sense that we are giving to something, I'm not sure it's always the good sense. that it was initially in the traditional way to do. So sometimes I think it's a little bit touchy.
Yes.
Touchy
Yeah.
Yeah.
No, of course, and I agree. And you know, as an Indigenous person, living in a city and not in my community, I live a different reality than a lot of other Indigenous people.
Yes.
That being said, cultural appropriation, yes, it does exist, and I would suggest if you are a non-Indigenous teacher and want to teach about that, first of all, that's amazing. That is such a huge step to take, to want to teach your kids or your students about Indigenous culture, whether that be in the curriculum or not. That being said, I think it's important to bring in Indigenous educators that are skilled in these craft makings. That because of the weight that it carries in Indigenous teachings, whether that be the Dreamcatcher. From my knowledge, I understand that the Dreamcatcher has many different teachings where you go, whether it be here in Winnipeg or in Ottawa, where I learned about them. So there is definitely different knowledges and teachings with a lot of these crafts. I think you have to tread lightly around who's teaching that. Are you as a teacher facilitating an Indigenous educator coming in, or are you teaching it yourself? To answer your question, my belief as an Indigenous person is that a non-Indigenous educator shouldn't necessarily be teaching about Indigenous crafts without the prior knowledge to them. I think giving people misinformation is obviously dangerous, and we don't want to do that. But instead, you should be seeking out those Indigenous educators, and don't. I would say not to be hesitant to reach out to that. I think a lot of Indigenous educators would be more than thankful to reach out to your students. Thank you.
I just want to add to that. I think that there's something to be said for appreciating a culture, and if you want to do something like Gavin said, like make a dream catcher or something, and you're appreciating elements in a culture, that's totally fine. Like you shouldn't worry about those kinds of things. If you want to bring in an art project or something, again, reaching out to elders in the community or just or community members and asking them for their input and coming in to to share. Like, for example, like in my school, we had a high tanning day, as a cultural day, where we brought in students from another school and we were teaching them how to make hides. This is not cultural appropriation, because making hides was part of something I did when I in my family. My mother grew up learning how to make hides from her grandmother, and she taught it to me, and we were teaching it now to my students. But the sake of making hides is like a lot of the non-Indigenous students were at a school learning that skill of making hides. Yes, it's not part of their culture, but they got to experience it because we're teaching it as kind of like a cultural revitalization kind of thing. A lot of people that was a traditional skill that was in danger of being lost. And so we are teaching it and showing that, we from the tanned hide, we made moccasins and mucklucks and all kinds of other different things with it. And we showed that's what we grew up, wearing it in the wintertime, is, those kinds of things. And just being able to show that was a traditional skill that we had, and we're continuing on with it today. That's if it wasn't for having elders that could come in and help instruct with that, and having other people appreciate that skill. I mean, I think it depends on your mindset that you're going into something. If you're trying to just learn somebody else's customs and teach somebody else's customs, that's, like, to what end are you doing that for? In our case, we just wanted to pass on that skill and share it. and share it with others.
Thank you, Maxine. I think we have one more question, if time permits. The question is, again, about teaching, and it's, I was told as a white or a non-Indigenous teacher, I should not teach the 7 grandfathers' teachings, but my school board has a manual. I'm confused. That's really interesting. I'd like to pass that on to someone else and then I can answer after. Yeah, that'd be great.
Okay, I just want to say something about this. The 7 sacred teachings, like they're called sacred because they're sacred, and they're meaningful. Like they, you know, they're not something that should just be relegated to, you know, just a bunch of little art, like art, or, you know, like a set of classroom rules. I don't think, like, it would be the same thing as going to another person's culture and you know, teaching about, I don't know, like, you know, whatever like another religion, and teaching about somebody else's religion, and you know, just, you know, making a little crafts or little sayings or classroom rules or things like that. It just, 7 sacred teachings, if you're gonna share them with your classroom, and there's nothing wrong with sharing them with your classroom, if you're gonna share them, then do it the right way. Bring in somebody who knows about these teachings, and if you're gonna approach an elder, you approach, and especially, you know, to do with sacred teachings, then you observe whatever the protocols are for that elder in that territory or that area, and then you just approach the elder properly, and then you ask for their guidance, and have them come in and show you the proper way to teach it. And then from there, you can, once the teachings have been given to you, and you as an educator have learned from the elder, and you've got, I guess it's in your heart to do the right thing, then you can teach it. You know, if it's been given to you and you've been instructed how to teach your students, then you can pass it on to your students. But just to try to kind of learn from a manual or something that you haven't been properly taught, I think it just, it's not, to me, it's not as authentic. I think if you're going to do something, do it in the right way, and get the right teaching for it, like the right instruction. And again, it's your mindset, I guess, and what's inside of you. Like, why are you doing what you're doing? You need to know your why.
Can I just add something? I know we're out of time, but for those teachers who are not Indigenous and being sort of afraid and not knowing what you can do or can't do, can I just tell you there's something you can always do, and you never have to worry about being called out for it, and that is support and be an advocate of Indigenous children by learning about current circumstances and having them join in the campaigns, actively joining in campaigns to make their lives better. That is something that you don't have to have someone from the community come in for. You can learn about these things with your students. It can be incredibly insightful, and you can do that work to try to get our leaders, hold our leaders responsible for helping now. You're not going to get one Indigenous person that says that's not okay. You will be 100% correct, because as a settler teacher, as a representative of our culture that we want to be unlearning, right? We want to be decolonizing. That is a wonderful way to do it with your students, and they can do it in kindergarten. They can write postcards. They can join the Shannon's Dream campaign. They can do so much, and you can be proud of yourself for helping, not just helping them along, but for also doing so much to address systemic racism.
Thank you. I hate to be the one to stop this because we're having such a fantastic discussion, and I know there are many questions that we didn't even get to today, but we are out of time, and I just want to encourage everyone to keep this conversation going as we're going back to school and as we approach Truth and Reconciliation Week that's taking place at the end of September and even beyond. I want to express my heartfelt thanks to Maxine, Sylvia, Gavin, and Natasha for participating in today's event and for just being so open with your guidance, experience, and advice. This has been really eye-opening and a wonderful experience for us all. And to all the teachers who are watching us, thank you for joining us today. Thank you for your thoughtful questions and for taking this time. We hope that you're able to bring what you've learned today into the classroom and that you can see that there are many ways to take active and allied roles in this journey. I wish you all the best in the new school year, and I hope you have a wonderful, wonderful rest of your day. Thank you.